All right, winners and losers of the Revolutionary War, the American Revolutionary War, which of course is an outgrowth of the French and Indian War that the Treaty of Paris 1763 ended. That was really the First World War, a war between Britain and its allies, the countries that Great Britain had on its side, and France and its allies, which took place, fighting took place really around the world. At the end of the French and Indian War, of course, the Americans were very loyal, very happy that the British had come over, the British government had come over to defend them, sent a large British Navy and army to defend them. The British government, on the other hand, now had a terrific war debt to pay because wars cost money and long wars cost lots of money, but world wars cost an astronomical amount of money. And who better to pay off that war debt, the British government thought, than the colonials. The American colonials could help pay off that war debt, since from the British government standpoint, the British colonials in America started the war with George Washington's foray against Fort Duquesne and the eventual battles of surrender at Fort Necessity and then Braddock's defeat, those sorts of things. And so the British government started imposing a series of tax measures on the American colonists, which, as we all know, backfired on the British government, angered many American colonists. Eventually, to go along with the tax measures, the Intolerable and Coercive Acts, same thing, different names, were placed on the colonies, especially Massachusetts, which closed down the port of Boston and canceled Massachusetts charter and enacted a new quartering act where British troops could stay in your home, and established a sort of a dictator with a military governor there, General Gage. As we've seen, General Gage tried to prevent a war, tried to stop a war from happening by taking colonial gunpowder and munitions, weapons, etc. But that backfired on him at the battles of Lexington and Concord, which starts the American Revolutionary War, which called the shot heard around the world. And of course, it's during that war that many Americans reading Common Sense Reasons by Thomas Paine, to leave England, announced their independence in the Declaration of Independence, which basically stated that people are born with certain rights, and we create a government, the people create a government to protect those rights. And if government does not protect those rights and instead just starts taking them away, then the people have the right to change or even abolish that government and create a new one. And of course, in the Declaration of Independence, the Americans were saying we're going to create a new government independent of Great Britain. But simply saying something doesn't mean you actually do it. So the American colonists would have to fight for their independence, in which they did. The two big British defeats of the war, Saratoga, where an entire British army was captured, and Yorktown, where another entire British army was captured, certainly did not help the British government side. Neither did the fact that the French entered the war on the American side, and the colonial escapade, the colonial war, had become a world war for the British government. And again, wars cost money, long wars cost lots of money, world wars cost an astronomical amount of money. So after the Battle of Yorktown, with the British government fighting around the world, the British government, the new British government that takes over from the one that was sort of cast out of office by elections, the new government ended the war in the Treaty of Paris 1783. So when the war's over, we'll look at the winners and losers of the war. So we have a sort of a long list of winners and losers, some which or may not surprise you. So the first one is Britain. Now, of course, you might expect that Britain would be the big loser of the war. Nope. Actually, Britain will turn out to be a big winner of the war. And of course, you're going, well, but how does that work? I mean, you know, it's the Americans versus the British, and if we won, didn't they lose? Well, sometimes history sort of fools you. So remember, one of the reasons the British colonists wanted, the British government wanted the colonies in the first place was to make money, contributed to the economy. It contributed money, contributed finance to the British government. But as it turns out, the British could continue to trade with the new United States, and the British could make even more money trading. Plus, they didn't have to defend the colonies anymore, which means they didn't have to send over an army or navy or anything like that, or they didn't have to administer the government, and all, of course, that costs money. So the British end up actually making more money than ever before. Go figure. And in the long term, the British are going to make a valuable ally, because these Americans, they have, of course, defeated the British Army, at least outlasted the British Army. But in many ways, they're still British. Their heritage comes from the British heritage. They treasure those rights that are listed in the Magna Carta in 1215, just like English people treasure those rights that are listed in the Magna Carta from 1215. So in many ways, even for a time, although it seemed that Americans, were sort of thinking they're superior because they defeated the British, which is the superpower of the day. In the long run, what's going to happen is that basically as countries, America and Britain becomes good friends. And eventually, of course, in World War I, the United States helps Britain, the official World War I, the Americans helped Britain win that war. And when World War II comes along, the Americans help save Britain and help them win that war as well. We fight together in what's called the Cold War, which sometimes is not too cold, but hot. And we fought together in many different places around the world, British troops and American troops, and we're still allies to this day. So it's a strange coincidence or a strange twist that you can have two sides. And of course, in the American scheme of things, in our sports, for example, if you have two sides, one's always going to be the winner and one's always going to be the loser. However, not necessarily in international affairs. So Britain turns out to be a big winner. And in fact, this will even spur them in some ways to sort of reform their own government and their own set of laws back in England as well. So another big winner is Canada. Oh, Canada, our home and native land, which is how the Canadian national anthem actually starts out. Remember, the Americans tried to capture Canada to use it as a bargaining chip at the beginning of the war against Britain, but that did not work out for the American side very well. But at the end of the war, America still has a lot of loyalists, a lot of people still loyal to England, probably about 100,000 loyalists, and those loyalists don't want to remain in an independent America. They want to be under British rule. Now, probably half of the 100,000 probably go to live on British islands or go back to Britain. Well, many of them have never been to Britain, but go to Britain or go to British islands. But another half, at least 50,000, move up to Canada, which of course was a British province, part of Britain at the time. And this probably increased the Canadian population by at least 50%, if not more. Many Americans, these loyalists, started towns in Canada, which are still there today. The British government even had a little name for them. They called them the United Empire Loyalist, and some of their descendants are very proud of that term even today in Canada. So many of those loyalists went to what's called Upper Canada, which you might think, of course, would be like the northern part of Canada. But the Upper Canada is actually the lower part of Canada, because when they say upper and lower, they're talking about the St. Lawrence River. So at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, that's called Lower Canada, because it's lower to the coast. It's, it's coming out to the ocean. And as you move up in altitude towards the Great Lakes, you get Upper Canada. So many American loyalists moved to Upper Canada in what we now know as Ontario. And other Americans, probably about 20,000 maybe, and in fact many freed slaves and runaway slaves moved to the maritime colonies, which are the New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and the islands off Canada to sort of your right-hand side of the map. Now, by the way, at least some of these loyalists took their slaves with them because slavery was still legal in Canada. It was a part of the British Empire. and eventually the British government would abolish slavery in the British Empire in the 1830s, about 30 years before the Americans abolished slavery. But until that time, some of those slaves that had been on maybe plantations in the South, and the Loyalists loaded up their ships and sailed to Canada and took some of their slaves with them. Others, free African Americans and runaway slaves, often found freedom in the maritime colonies and eventually started their own towns and areas there as well. So Canada was a big winner, so to speak, of the American Revolutionary War, because not only did they get a large population, but they also got the Loyalists, many of them were very educated people and were able to sort of shape the future of Canadian government and politics. So another big winner, democracy. Demos krasi from the Greek, the people rule. Sometimes we call it popular sovereignty from the Latin, which means the people rule. Sometimes we just say the people rule, which is the English version of that. So it proved democracy was possible on a very large scale. Now, in 1776, there were some very small-scale democracies around the world. Some of the Italian city-states, for example, Genoa, etc., they allowed males to vote for certain leaders, and these small groups, probably not more than maybe a couple 100,000 people each. So there were a number of these small democracies where basically the citizens sort of elected their government and the government worked for the people, etc. But there had never been a large-scale democracy, especially over such a vast land area with so many different types of people that were already in America. And because the Americans were successful in getting their independence, and Americans were eventually, as we will see, eventually successful in setting up a government that worked, the idea that democracy could work for large numbers of people in large countries became an idea that very quickly sort of moved throughout the world. So the idea of democracy was a pretty big winner from the Revolutionary War. A loser of the Revolutionary War was France, our ally, the country that had come to help us out in our time of need. Funny how things work out. The country we were fighting, Britain, actually turned out to be the winner, and the country that came to our aid to help us actually would turn out to be a loser. And the reason for that is that, again, wars cost money, long wars cost lots of money, and world wars cost an astronomical amount of money. So the French had fought sort of the First World War, the French and Indian War, we called it, and the 7 Years' War in Europe is what they called it. And that war ended in 1763. And then, less than 20 years later or so, the French are coming to help us out, and that turns into another world war for them. So within just a few years of the American Revolution ending and we're setting up our government, the French government was bankrupt. And when the King of France basically ordered the people to pay more money, to pay him, the King of France, more money, so France would have more money, the people said, wait, money? We seem to remember something from that American Revolutionary War. Some of us fought in that, and they had like some little motto. I think it was no taxation without representation. So, dear King of France, we're not going to pay your taxes unless we get actually to vote on you. And of course, the king is thinking, well, what? Vote on me? No, I'm the king. I just make the law. I enforce the law. I'm your leader. You don't vote on me. I'm just the king. And that starts off a revolution in France, a revolution in which the king loses badly, because not only does the king lose his throne, the king loses his head because the people chop it off for him. So the King of France turns out to be sort of a big loser for that. And because of that French Revolution, France is going to be sort of in turmoil for many, many years to come. So interesting enough, even though they helped us gain our independence, the French suffered as a result of that. course, one of the countries in Europe that helped France, who was sort of France's friend in Europe, Spain, also helped us. Now, you might remember that Governor Galvez had organized cattle drives and shipped those cows up to the western area along the Mississippi River and sent guns and other supplies up the Mississippi River for the Patriots fighting the West, which, of course, was very nice. And that's basically because the Spanish, like the French, didn't like the British. The Spanish never really liked the Americans. After all, we were British to begin with. But even more so because of the map. Because the Spanish claimed a large area of land, not just in South America, not just in Central America, but in Northern America as well. And as the war starts, as the Revolutionary War starts, the Spanish are somewhat afraid that if America gets its independence, that these Americans who are already pushing over the Appalachian Mountains moving west could just keep moving west. And those Americans just keep moving west and take over places like Spanish Texas and Spanish California. Now, isn't that the silliest thing you ever heard? Oh, wait, that's what happened. So the Spanish actually had reason to fear what was going to happen, and that eventually did happen. The Spanish, by the way, of course, also in this World War cost them money. And interesting enough, because of what happens in France, because, of course, they bankrupt themselves helping the United States, and they have the French Revolution. That French Revolution produces a general named Napoleon, and Napoleon then turns around and invades invades Spain and takes it over. So eventually, Spain is going to be sort of a big loser in the American Revolution for two reasons. One, it sort of is taken over by France, and the French, of course, probably wouldn't have taken over except because of our revolution bankrupted them. And then the other way they're a big loser is that in the end, the United States ends up basically with almost all their territory in North America. So international wars and international diplomacy have a strange way of working out. Sometimes not the way you think they're going to work out. Another big loser in the American Revolutionary War were the Indians. So the Indians were a big loser because when the war ends, the United States acquires this large area of land all the way to the Mississippi River. And so now these Americans who had wanted to move over there in the first place, but has been stopped by the proclamation of 1763, where the British government said, hey, don't cross those Appalachian Mountains, that's Indian country. But now those Americans are moving west, right onto Indian land. So before, the Indians at least had the French to help them at first, and then that entire area, of course, was taken from the French in the French-Indian War in the Treaty of Paris 1763, but then at least the Indians had the British to help them out and keep those sort of westward-thinking Americans out of the Indians' way. But now the British are gone, and now that entire area is Americans, and of course that's going to not be of benefit to the Indians at all, no matter what tribe they were from. This is really going to hurt most of the tribes in this area in a relatively short period of time. So when the Revolutionary War starts, most of the Indians were basically in favor of the British and fought for the British because they believed the British would basically keep this area basically as a place for the Indians. But of course, now the British have moved on and left this area to the Americans. And of course, the Americans, first of all, are looking for land, but they're also not going to forget that most of the Indians over here had helped the British against them. So again, it's not going to be looking good for the Indians. Another winner, the United States of America. So we gain our independence from Britain. And we'll be setting up our own type of government. a constitutional republic with elements of democracy. But in the Treaty of Paris, the United States also gets some other things. And one of the reasons the British gave us or acknowledged more of our independence was it was one thing, it was a bad thing to lose the British colonists in America, but it would be even worse if the British colonists in America then joined with one of Britain's enemies, like France or Spain. So Britain wanted to make sure that the United States was going to be strong enough not to have to go crawling or go asking the French and Spanish for help. And so in addition to our independence, we basically, the British government acknowledges the independence of the land all the way to the Mississippi River. And in exchange, by the way, the Americans also acknowledge that the British still have a right to travel up and down the Mississippi River, because remember, the Mississippi River basically leads up to the Great Lakes, which is, of course, where Canada is, so it's another way into Canada. But more than that, the British also granted us fishing rights off Canada in what's called the Grand Banks. Of course, generally when you think of a bank, you think of a place where you have lots of money. Well, in a way, this place has lots of money. It's just not dollar bills in the ocean, though. It's fish in the ocean. So, of course, you can catch the fish and you can sell the fish. You'll make a lot of money. So the Grand Banks was a place, and still is, where there's a lot of fish in one sort of area that's very defined, and fishermen can go in that area. Even today, that area is still being fished by both Canadians and Americans. They also gave us trading rights with England. Now, of course, if you're really mad at someone, you might say, well, I'm never going to talk to you again. You know, I'm never going to be your friend again. But the British recognized, again, that they needed to keep America strong enough so that we would not fall into the influence of France or Spain. The British also, however, recognized that, again, they might be making some money off of us. So basically, within a few short years, the trading situation was basically back to normal. That is, that Americans are basically buying British-made goods in large numbers, and a lot of money was then flowing to England. And so, obviously, the United States is a big winner. Yay, us. USA, USA, USA. Another big winner. Now, by the way, of course, on this chart, at the very end, just as an example, I put Benedict Arnold as a loser. Of course, Benedict Arnold, who had started out as sort of as a wealthy merchant from Connecticut and spent all his money on the Revolutionary War, had become a general. Remember, he had sort of, by 1780, been disillusioned because he didn't rise in the ranks fast enough. He wasn't second in command of the army like he thought he should be. You know, he had been called a crook, even though he wasn't a crook. And he was wondering, you know, about his retirement plan that Congress wasn't going to give them. You might remember that then Benedict Arnold decides to not only change sides, but he decides to change sides in a spectacular way by basically asking George Washington if he could become the commander of West Point. West Point, the fort, of course, it's a military establishment today, the military academy at West Point. But back then it was a big fort that kept the British ships in New York from sailing up the river to take over Albany and split New England off from the rest of the country. So that was still theoretically possible if Fort West Point could be captured. So with Benedict Arnold as commander of the fort, of course, he agrees to basically open the gates and let the British troops into West Point so they can take over. And of course, then the British Navy could just sailed up to Albany and basically taken it over. And along with the defeats that were happening in the South, that probably would have ended the Revolutionary War, and basically the British would have won. But of course, even more so, Arnold, suggested that the British government tell him the day they were going to attack the fort, and he would even have George Washington there to, so the British could capture him as well. So his becoming a traitor, he did it in a very spectacular way. Now, the British, by the way, did hold up there in the bargain. They did make him a general. They did give him a retirement plan. In fact, just within a few months of him sort of escaping the Americans from the north, he was reunited with his wife, and he became a general fighting in the South. Still during the American Revolutionary War, he led troops. In fact, he led troops to Monticello, where Thomas Jefferson lived, and almost captured Thomas Jefferson, the writer of the Declaration of Independence. But eventually, when the British sort of give up the Americas, Arnold goes to living in England, where he thinks he's going to sort of be the hero of the hour, but in reality, nobody really likes him, or very few people like him, because nobody likes a traitor, because they figure that you might betray them sometime. So eventually, Benedict Arnold goes to live in Canada, where he dies and is peacefully in his sleep. Not exactly super rich, but not exactly super poor either. But nevertheless, interesting. So we'd probably call Benedict Arnold sort of a loser in the Revolutionary War, because he sort of lost his reputation and lost his chance to become, probably one of the more historical figures in American history, as far as a good historical figure. However, George Washington, also a big winner in the war. Now, if you ask how someone can be a big winner when their record is 3-8-1, when they've won 3 victories, and 2 of those were very small ones at Trenton and Princeton, and they've lost 8 times, the French Indian War twice, and of course 6 battles, and including losing the capital city of America, Philadelphia at the time, to the British, and of course 1 tie at Mammoth Courthouse. You might wonder how you become a hero, and the reason is that Washington never had to necessarily beat the British Army in battle. Washington just needed to keep his army alive. He just needed to not lose. And in not losing, he becomes the winner. Of course, his big victory at Yorktown, of course, was helped by a French army that was with him, the French Navy as well. But nevertheless, because he never gave up, he ends up winning the war. And it's really difficult, at least for me as a historian, to look back at the possible candidates that might have been a general at the beginning of the war besides George Washington, because I look at many of them, and what happens in the war, many of them tend to retreat. I mean, basically just give up. And probably it's hard to see any of those sort of people that Congress might have given the generalship to besides Washington as actually lasting all those years and actually keeping the army together. So Washington was, and Washington was also was a leader of a spy network. He started a great spy network in America to keep track of British movements and troops and where they were, and that certainly helped win the war for the Americans as well. He was also a pretty good diplomat. He could sort of go to Congress and send messages to Congress to, if not at least get supplies for the army, at least help the army, at least not to hurt the army. So Washington had a lot of different good attributes that served him well in the Revolutionary War. And of course, one of his best attributes was that he never gave up. He despite overwhelming odds, despite sometimes having almost 0 troops to fight with, despite sometimes having no food for his troops and almost sometimes no weapons for a troop, he never gave up. And in never giving up, he outlasts the British and wins the war. And by the way, that might be an important lesson for all of our lives. You don't have to win all the battles of your life to be a winner. In fact, you don't. If Washington's any example, you don't even have to win most of the battles of your life to be the winner. All you have to do is hang on and never give up and outlast those problems. But Washington becomes even greater in 1781. Of course, the Battle of Yorktown, the last major battle of the war. The British still, of course, still have Savannah. They still have troops there. They still have troops in New York. And it's going to take some time to get those troops, to leave America and ship them home. It's going to take time to work out a peace treaty. While they're working out a peace treaty, while the Americans and British are working out a peace treaty, George Washington just can't let the army go home. Because if there's no army, the British army in New York might say, well, look, we have no opposition. We can just take over America. Woo! Let's win. So Washington has to keep the army together. So he moves his headquarters to a place called Newburgh, New York, north of New York City, where he can keep an eye on the British troops there and make sure the British troops know the American army is still intact. But it's really at Newburgh that maybe American army faces its biggest crisis. And it's not a military battle. It's not a battle where you're shooting at people. It's another type of battle, because at Newburgh there's not much to do. You're just waiting. If you're an ordinary guy, waiting to go home. You're waiting for the British to evacuate New York, and then you can go home. And for the officers there, many of the officers, however, had so much time, they start thinking like Benedict Arnold did back in 1780. They start thinking, what am I going to go home to? Because just like Benedict Arnold, most of the officers that served with Washington in the American Army had been rich before the war. They had owned businesses before the war. They had owned farms before the war. And they had not been home for years. And as a result, their businesses were bankrupt. Their farms were bankrupt. Many of them had money sort of in the bank before the war, but they had spent that money on the war itself. They had basically bought guns and uniforms for their own troops during the war. And now these officers were about to go home. But what were they going to go home to? Well, not to a nice farm, not to a nice business, because those were gone. And probably not even to a nice house. Probably that was already been taken over by their creditors. And how were they going to support their families now the war is over? And many of the officers start thinking about this retirement plan, this half pay for life, where, again, half pay for life, this retirement plan the Army is asking for, it's not much. It's not like you're going to get rich, because Army pay was not much. And half of not much is even less than not much. But at least it will stop you from starving on the street. At least it might give you some place that you might, maybe not buy a big house, but maybe might rent a smaller place to live for your family. At least they won't be on the street starving to death. And so many of the officers had asked Congress for a retirement plan, and so far the answer had been no. Again, basically Congress was saying, first of all, you should be glad you got to fight for us on the right side, and second of all, we don't have any money. But there at Newburgh, some of the officers start thinking about a plan to pressure Congress to pass this retirement plan. A plan to basically, maybe like lead the Army down the road to where Congress is meeting, and maybe take their guns with them, and maybe sort of enter the room where Congress is meeting, and maybe point their guns at Congress and said, hey, I think you need to vote for our retirement plan. That is, they were thinking about a military takeover of government called a coup d'etat. A military coup. And of course, everybody knew Washington would never take part in this plan. The officers knew that Washington would never have anything to do with this. And so they looked around for some other leader, and they found it in perhaps General Gates, who had, at Saratoga, basically had ordered Benedict Arnold not to fight at Saratoga because he was, jealous of Benedict Arnold. But nevertheless, so these officers were going to sort of meet and discuss what they should do. Naturally, they did not invite George Washington. So the officers are meeting, and who walks in? George Washington. And he says, gentlemen, I address you, may I speak to you? And of course the officer says, well, you can't say no to your commanding officer. And so the officer says, well, yeah, sure, okay. And of course they're probably thinking, yeah, he's probably going to try to talk us out of it, but we're not going to listen to him. Sometimes that might happen to you at school. A teacher might stop you in the hallway, and of course you're just thinking about, as they're talking, you're thinking about going to your next class, or whatever they're talking about. You're not even really listening. It's all blah, 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 blah. And you're sort of nodding your head, and then you leave. So probably that's where many officers were thinking. So Washington sees that the officers are not really listening to him. So he says, gentlemen, may I read a letter? And this is a letter that a congressman had sent Washington promising to try to get Congress to try to get this retirement plan passed. And as he pulls out the letter and looks at it, The thing that Washington does next stuns everyone in the room. Washington pulls out a pair of eyeglasses, and he puts them on. He notices that everyone in the room has stopped talking. Everyone is just simply staring at him, because these officers had never seen Washington glasses before. To them, Washington was a symbol of strength. He was like Superman for them. You know, they had seen him several times. They had seen shots. They had seen bullet holes in his clothes and in his hat from fighting. But the bullets never seemed to touch George Washington. It seemed like he was almost magically or somehow too tough to even penetrate by a bullet. So when he puts on the glasses, many of the officers are thinking, you know, this doesn't quite make sense. I mean, this is some weakness, but George Washington isn't a weak man. He's super strong. How does it? And Washington notices they're sort of stunned. And he says, "Gentlemen, you must excuse me. I have grown gray in the service of my country, and now I find myself growing blind as well." And to you, those words mean nothing. But to the officers in the room, they symbolized, they encapsulated, they took in everything they felt. They too had grown gray in the service of their country. They had fought 8 years. They had been away from their families most of that time. They had given everything for this cause. They had given everything. They had risked their lives. Some of them actually had injuries from this war. They had basically given up their families for this war, their homes for this war, their money for this war. And what did they hope to achieve in this war? They wanted to create a government where the people ruled, where not a king ruled, not a small group of rich people or important people or powerful people ruled, but the ordinary people ruled. They had spent 8 long years sacrificing everything they had to create this dream of an independent United States where the people rule. And then they realized they'd almost destroyed it by this military coup, by having the military take over the government by force. And when they realized, as these words sort of sank in and they realized what they'd almost done, they started to cry. They cried like babies. We have many journals from these men that wrote during this time period, and many of them were there in this room, and basically all say the same thing. These hardened men, these men who had seen terrible things in battle, who had frozen during the winter at Valley Forge and other places, these men who had led others to their death, these hardened men, they started to cry when they realized what they had done. Well, after that, there was no more talk of a military takeover. Eventually, the peace treaty was signed. The army was disbanded. The soldiers went home. The nice part about it is that eventually Congress never got around to a retirement plan, but they did basically pay the army 5 years back wages. That is money they owed the officers. So eventually the officer got something. Washington becomes even greater after that. In December 1783, Washington goes before Congress and basically says, "Gentlemen, it has been an honor serving you. It's been an honor serving my country. I resign. I retire. I'm going back to being a farmer at Mount Vernon. I love being a farmer." And in fact, throughout history, Washington wants nothing more than just to be a farmer at Mount Vernon. Washington never seeks greatness. He never seeks high office. He never really seeks all these things that other people consider important. He just wants to be an awesome farmer. And in resigning, when he had all this power, if we look back at history, we don't see many leaders having, all this power and all this fame, and everyone would basically do whatever you asked them to do, we don't see many of those people saying, oh, you don't have to do anything for me. I'm just going back to being an ordinary person. But that's what Washington does. And in that way, he sets a new standard for greatness. Greatness is not gaining power. Greatness is giving up power. Greatness is not leading people. Greatness is serving people. So George Washington, a big winner of the war, United States of America, big winner of the war. And here we have Washington handing in his resignation to Congress. As I resign this part of history with you.